Hello, dear viewer. I hope you've already subscribed by clicking the bell so you don't miss new parts or new stories. Enjoy the story, and of course have fun watching it. Post-scriptum. This story was written by a user under the nickname Burnt Redstone, and I only did the censorship so that this story could be heard by my viewers on YouTube. I do not claim authorship of this story. Letter. Chapter 1, Part 1. The end of one life and the new direction of another is packed into a few seconds. A second. Tyson looks at his wife of 20 years, sitting in the passenger seat, already beginning to regret the hurtful words he just blurted out. 2 seconds. Tyson catches the movement of something huge and dark, rapidly filling the passenger side window, behind Imani's angry expression, as her beautiful face turns toward him. 3 seconds. The impact is too strong to feel, and too strong to register. Sounds too loud to hear, but clearly perceptible. Flashes of light and darkness. Pain and nothingness. Too much of both. Unknown. Seconds later, Tyson rises to the surface and sees stars through the tall grasses, the cold water from the ditch soaking the remains of his clothes. The sensation of pain overwhelms him once again, and he knows she's gone. No, no, no. Tyson lifted himself off the pillow and gasped as the recurring nightmare forced him awake, as it had done so often over the past 5 years. A phantom pain swam through his body, making him remember the year he'd spent in the hospital recovering from his injuries. Seemingly endless hours spent fighting the pain to get his body to function again. Once his hands regained the ability to grip, and his hands regained mobility, once his feet were able to balance his mass, and his legs were able to support and push him upright, he resigned himself to the mechanism of finding a way to override the mental pain with purely physical pain. The excess was being shed, and he carried it within him. Layers seemed to be peeled off as he tried to find a reason to continue. He was becoming a new person, but for what? The weakness was slowly turning into strength, but he still persisted. He convinced himself that the pain was cleansing him, but really it was just avoidance. After a year of relentless training, the physical therapists allowed him to go to the gym only under supervision. This forced him to focus on grief counseling. He needed to stop avoiding the mental anguish that was causing him to bury himself in pain. It took another 8 months before doctors deemed him safe enough to send him home. "Oh, Sugar, is it that bad dream again?" Her voice was painfully familiar and yet so out of place. Tyson's heart clenched every time he heard it, but he refused to react. He'd pulled himself out of the darkness as he recovered in the hospital, and the foundation on which he was building his new life depended on the sharpness of his mind. He wasn't about to give that up. Imani was dead. She's gone. She wasn't sitting on the edge of his bed, slim and trim in her silk nightie, her mane of curly hair waiting for his fingers, her milk chocolate-colored skin begging for his touch, looking up at him with soft brown eyes full of love and compassion. Tyson sank back onto the pillow, closing his eyes and rubbing his face. He ran through his equations, and when he got to the result, he opened his eyes. She was gone, as always. The doctors peppered him with jargon words, trying to make sense of his feelings, his memories of the disaster, and his relationship to his mother. Survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder topped the list, but there were many others he'd forgotten the names of. He had never spoken to the doctors about Imani's nocturnal visits. If he had, he'd probably still be in the hospital. It was easier to just accept the occasional brain malfunction and move on with his life. Besides, he had another love, math, which was bringing rationality back into his mind. She began appearing to him at night after he began to seriously exert himself in physical therapy. As he lay in his bed, screaming with muscle pain, he hallucinated that she had come to him. From the beginning, he knew enough not to talk about it. Information about what it could mean was given to him after he was sent home. He had read a lot about what the mind could do to cope with the loss of a loved one, especially after a traumatic accident. His unwillingness to come to terms with her loss, demonstrated just a few minutes ago by his screams upon waking, meant that his mind was looking for ways to fill that gap in his life. Where only a vacuum existed, his mind filled the void with her. 5 years is a long time to hallucinate, but as with the loneliness and routines, he found solace in familiar surroundings. Perhaps he just wasn't ready to move on. As is always the case after a nightmare, his thoughts returned to the night of the party. Tyson didn't even want to go. It was Imani who had been so insistent on getting out of the house, saying they had to show up, because this man had been so favorable to them. He was the one who had helped Tyson get a position as a professor of higher mathematics at the local university. At least that's what he told everyone. Tyson knew the truth. It was all thanks to the dean's wife. The party was to celebrate the dean's retirement. Franklin Dunnings was leaving his post and was seeking a hassle-free lifestyle in a village on a tropical coast in some Central American country. Tyson, Imani, his co-workers and their spouses gathered at his home for one last party before he and his wife embarked on a new chapter of their lives. Tyson wasn't sure this new plan really needed his childhood friend. Ashley Dunnings, born Ashley Collins, had lived next door to Tyson for as long as he could remember. They went to kindergarten and college together and were best friends until Tyson's gift for understanding the true nature of numbers, both real and theoretical, forced him to leave his hometown to study under masters at several universities around the world. When he finally returned, he found that he had missed his best friend's wedding. Celebrating his return and happy that Ashley had found a soulmate, he got a little drunk, fell down the stairs, and ended up at Imani Hospital. She introduced herself to the genius who couldn't navigate the 5 stairs, and his heart went out to her. On the day of the party, the guests discovered that Ashley was missing, which was a first. Franklin made excuses for her and insisted that the party continue, even though Ashley's effervescent personality is what made the whole event happen. Tyson really wanted to leave, as he had never gotten close to Franklin and felt no particular sadness about him leaving the university. On the other hand, Imani felt much more comfortable at this party than at previous events at this house. He wondered if it was because Ashley wasn't there. He had noticed a little friction between them in the past. 90 minutes later, Ashley burst into the center of the party like a wind of anger. It wasn't easy to make such an impression on a slender woman with a beautiful mane of blonde hair. They immediately realized that she had been drinking and crying, but she had reached a phase of anger that she had to go through. Tyson exchanged a nervous glance with Imani. As entertainment, Ashley loudly announced to the crowd that her husband was having an affair with a young student. It turned out that Ashley had just returned from the detective's office and had incriminating photos to share with everyone. When Franklin returned from the basement with a drink, a terrible shouting match broke out between them, and Franklin eventually ran out of the house. Ashley had nothing left, her anger waning, and she collapsed to the ground, sobbing profusely. Tyson rushed to her aid and cast an incredulous look at Imani when his wife made a sound of protest. He lifted the crying woman into his arms and carried her upstairs to put her to bed, while Imani made sure the other guests went home. The party was over, and so was Franklin and Ashley's marriage. Tyson sat Ashley on the bed, her beautiful blonde hair spilling over the pillow. Their gazes met, and suddenly he found her arms wrapped around his neck, and her lips pressed against his. For a moment, Tyson let it happen. Then he gently removed her arms from his neck, and his lips from hers. She searched his gaze, but he could only shake his head silently. Their opportunity to be something more than just friends was gone. Ashley turned away and cried quietly. When he stepped out into the hallway, Imani was waiting for him. He looked at her, sad for his friend, and froze when he saw the anger in Imani's eyes. She held out a napkin to him, pointing to his mouth. He wiped his lips and saw the lipstick. "She's drunk." "You're not leaving. I'm leaving," Imani snarled and strode away, down the stairs and out the front door. He hurried after her, fearing that her statement meant more than it really did. As he drove them home, he could feel her eyes on him. "She took me by surprise," he said quietly. Silence. His anger began to build. He had done nothing but try to help his friend. Yes, she was a friend that could have become something more at one time, but it hadn't happened. "What in God's name do you want me to do? Turn my back on my friend when she's falling apart?" he exclaimed angrily. "She's just a friend?" "Lipstick says otherwise," Imani snarled. "I told you so. She took me by surprise. Her marriage had just crumbled horribly, and she was in pain. She was looking for something, someone to ease that pain. "Naturally, it has to be you," shouted Imani back. He inhaled sharply, and fury flared in him. He struggled to control his breathing. What do you have against Ashley?" "Oh, I don't know. Maybe it's the fact that she's going after the man who swore to be my faithful husband," she snorted. "An oath I have never broken and never will," he muttered back. As he raced down the winding country road toward the lake and the house, he could hear Imani trying to get her breathing under control. "I see the way she looks at you every time there are spouses at a faculty party," she said quietly, but with a promise of venom. "That bitch doesn't know when to say enough. Here it is." In that moment, it seemed to him that he didn't know this woman sitting next to him. The woman who had taken his breath away the day they'd met in the hospital. The woman he vowed to be faithful to for the rest of his life. Though not all the days had been sunny and rosy, they had lived to be 50 years together, she just a month ago, and he 3 years before that. He welcomed the idea of sharing their golden years together. Looking out the windshield at the old worn sidewalk and quiet railroad crossing ahead, he wondered if he even knew her. His thoughts drifted to the parties he attended at the hospital and at the homes of her co-workers. He knew that Imani was respected and loved by everyone at the hospital. However, the way she smiled sexily at some of the men, and the way they looked at her when she walked by, made him feel insecure. He fought those doubts as she always chatted with him at these events and kissed him lightly in the presence of others. He wondered about her hatred for Ashley as he went through these experiences, but he had never called her that. His mouth started moving before he realized what he was saying. "The difference is that I don't act the way I do with Ashley the way you do with Devon Wilson." Dr. Wilson was the chief surgeon of the hospital. Tall, trim, gorgeous, brilliant and single, he was a most attractive bachelor, in truth, divorced. Apparently there was something he wasn't good at. Watching her turn to face him, he could see her anger, but there was something else. Something he was deathly afraid of. Maybe it was doubt, or guilt. Then they found themselves on the tracks. "No!" Tyson shouted, pressing the heels of his palms to his eyes to break away from the memory. It was time to get moving. Start your day. Follow the routine of the day. There was serenity in the patterns. Part 2. Christy Taylor was having a bad day, and Friday was supposed to be a good day. She pouted, and those around her immediately looked in her direction. She knew she was beautiful. Although genetics had endowed her with many beautiful qualities, she worked hard to maximize her virtues. She used all the necessary skincare products to keep her skin flawless. She followed a strict diet of natural foods to stay healthy and trim. She frequented the gym to keep her slim body in perfect condition. Equally importantly, she visited the salon at least once a week to keep her long wavy blonde hair shiny and of perfect length, and her nails painted in the latest fashion. All her friends thought she should go to a modeling agency because she had the looks, posture, and height, but it wasn't her dream. She glanced down at her hand, admiring the deep red of the nail polish, and her gaze was drawn to the sparkling diamonds on her wedding ring. Once, just looking at it, had sent shivers down her body. Today, she felt nothing. Her fiancé, Blake Carlington, was handsome, fit, well-connected, and came from a family as wealthy as hers. But 8 months into their engagement, she'd realized there was no magic between them. No spark. Even sex didn't bring her satisfaction. In the last few months, she had definitely fallen into despondency. None of the activities that used to bring her joy made any sense to her. She went about her daily chores, maintaining her appearance, keeping up with fashion, but even shopping had lost its luster. She wasn't a fool. Christy didn't achieve such success just because of her good looks and social standing. She had a brain, and she knew how to use it. She was doing well in most subjects and was looking forward to graduating with the highest percentage of grades, or had envisioned that prospect months ago. Now she had been called in to meet with Professor Haley, her math teacher, since her grade in his class had dropped so much. She needed that stupid math credit to move on to the next course, but even the fear of falling behind kept her on her toes. The longing she felt sucked the significance of everything in her life out of her. Still, she had to keep up appearances. Christy knocked on the office door and heard a voice inviting her in. As she entered the office, she found herself in a paper chaos. From the state of his office, one could get the impression of George Haley as a Luddite, unwilling to move into the digital age. This was only true of his personal work. For computational experiments, he preferred paper. As for his day-to-day work with students, the university insisted that he hand out assignments digitally, but he sneaked paper in as often as possible. She saw a short, stout man with Einstein's trademark white hair and bushy mustache sitting at his desk. He looked up at her and smiled. "Ah, Miss Taylor, what can I do for you?" he asked, looking after her. She lifted a hand and twirled a strand of her blonde hair, looking back at him. "You asked me to come to you about my grades." The professor nodded, pinching himself on the bridge of his nose. "Yes, of course. Your grades are starting to drop, and if you don't change the situation, I'm afraid I'll have no choice but to fail you in class." "Isn't there some kind of test I could take to improve my grade?" she asked. He cast a piercing glance at her. "Understanding the material will help you improve your grade. The next exam will be crucial for you. You should have a firm grasp of the course material by then." She pouted again, as she knew the last few chapters had kept her on her toes. "I need a tutor." "Yes, I was just about to suggest the same thing," exclaimed Haley enthusiastically. "I know a local man who is not only a true genius in the field of mathematics, but one of the most natural teachers I've ever had the honor of working with. To have any chance of mastering this material as completely as you need to, in the short time you have, you need someone of his caliber." Christie cast a wary glance at the professor. "Is he here at the university?" A sad expression appeared and disappeared on the short man's face. "Not anymore. No. He retired early." Then his gaze stopped on Christie. "I hope I'm not emphasizing in vain that you risk failing my course. You'll have to get him to agree to teach you." A determined expression appeared on his face. He seemed to be thinking hard about something. Then a slight smile appeared on his lips. "I will provide you with a letter of recommendation, which should help, but you have to convince him to do it." He took a piece of paper and a pen and began to write the letter. "If he is such a good teacher as you say, why did he retire early?" Christie asked curiously, and her genuine interest in this enigmatic genius began to relieve the mental lethargy she was suffering from. Haley folded and sealed the letter in an envelope. He wrote something quickly on the outside, then handed it to her. Christie's eyes widened when she saw the name above the address. "Tyson Kane? The man who stopped the terrorists?" "Stop. Don't mention the event to him and the part he played in it. He lost his wife that night and doesn't need reminding." He gestured to a photograph hanging on the wall that showed a fat, bearded man in a suit, embracing a beautiful, slender woman with a large head of curly hair. "All Tyson needs to remember is his joy in teaching. A letter will get you in the door, but you must convince him that you will be a worthy student." Christie cast a shocked and disgusted look at the professor, as her thoughts took her to dark places, and he looked at her in confusion. "Are you saying that I should offer him sexual favors?" "What? No!" Haley shrieked angrily, and it was Christie's turn to look confused. Haley pouted. "Prove that you're going to make something of your life. Be worthy of him spending time on you. He doesn't respect those who float through life with minimal effort. Express your drive and ambition to him. Ask him to teach you, and you will pass my course." Christie looked nervously at the envelope as it began to dawn on her how important this was. "Go see him tomorrow. Do you have plans for Saturday morning?" he asked, and she shook her head. "Thank you, Professor Haley," she said with a nod to him, and left the office. She set a course for the library. She was going to make some inquiries about Mr. Kane. As she was treating this case as a business deal, she couldn't afford to lose. Christie needed to find out everything she could about the man she would be filing the papers for. George Haley lowered his heavy body into the deep padded chair as the pretty blonde left his office. He fixed his gaze on the door, and the thought of the lie he had written in the letter to his friend Tyson raced through his mind. He pushed the doubt away, for the little white lie was justified if he managed to break through the shell Tyson had erected around him. Becoming a recluse at the age of 58 was a crime, compounded by the fact that he was robbing the world of his genius. Young Miss Taylor did not know that Tyson truly despised drifters, but was becoming one himself. This clarified the man's self-esteem. If George were a religious man, he would be praying for Christie to succeed in bringing Tyson out of his self-isolation. He grinned to himself. Of course, it didn't hurt that this girl looked a lot like Ashley in her younger days. The smile slipped from his face as his thoughts turned to the woman who had disappeared the night of the dean's retirement celebration. For a while afterward, everyone had suspected that Franklin had done something terrible to her. Then, it was reported that she had left the country the next day. Most of the money from their joint bank account disappeared, and a law firm in New York approached Franklin with divorce papers. He did not have time to sign them, and a few days later, he sold the house and disappeared into the jungles of Central America. So Tyson's best friend disappeared, and so did his wife. George did his best to fill the gap, but he never managed to get through to his interlocutor. Perhaps there is a lack of femininity in his approach. Miss Taylor had plenty of those. Part 3. Tyson stood barefoot on the grass of the backyard, next to a small table and chairs he rarely used, unless you counted his daily morning routine. He unbuttoned his large terrycloth robe and threw it off his shoulders. He threw it over one of the chairs and walked forward toward the lake until he was on a small sandy patch at the edge of his property. This close to the water, he wasn't as hidden from the neighboring properties, but so far none of them had complained about his nude bathing habit, nor sunbathing for that matter. He never looked to see if anyone was watching him, but then he didn't care. He entered the cool water and walked until he could dive forward. The water was very bracing, but he endured the pain until he developed a nice smooth paddling pattern and warmed up his muscles. With so little body fat, he had to swim constantly or he would sink like a stone. Like every day, he swam in a straight line from his house until he felt the first signs of fatigue, at which point he had to turn around and swim back. If he made it back, he got a great cardio workout and increased his stamina and endurance. If he couldn't swim back, then he had given his best, and the lake would take him. Will it be today? 3 miles south of the campus was a beautiful lake, completely surrounded by dense forest. A 3-mile road ran along the northern edge of the lake, with 20 small houses on the only buildable section. The rest of the shoreline of the lake was sheer granite walls rising 10 to 20 feet above the surface of the water. The northern lip of the lake was a gradual slope with a sandy section before going into the deep water. This strip of houses had once been connected to the town by a narrow country road that meandered through granite ledges to the western edge of town. There were no houses on this stretch of road, and it was now closed to automobile traffic. Christie drove her white Mercedes-Benz C-Class coupe down the smooth paving stones of a road built only 4 years ago. It connected the eastern edge of town to the eastern end of the road that ran along the lake shore. From her research, she learned of the incredible and terrible fate that put Tyson Kane's car on the tracks, just as the locomotive pulled up to the inoperable crossing at speed. 2 emotionally exhausted high school students, victims of severe bullying at school, one the son of a railroad worker, the other the son of a construction foreman, plot to strike back at a town they feel has failed them. They managed to get an old steam locomotive out of the yard by attaching it to a flatbed car loaded with explosives and incendiaries they had made. They drove the train onto an abandoned branch line that led through the village, past a lake, and then turned off and into the very center of the old town. The young men planned to drive the train into the center of the city, detonate their bombs, and burn it to the ground. Instead, they struck Tyson's car, tearing it in two. He was thrown from the driver's seat into a ditch, and the rest of the car went under the train, causing it to derail a short distance to the east. Tyson's wife and 2 young men were killed, but the explosives did not detonate. In a remote and sparsely populated place with very little traffic, no one witnessed the accident or even knew it had occurred. 2 hours after the accident, the students' manifesto was automatically uploaded to social media, outlining their plan and their reasons for carrying it out. The Metropolitan Police were immediately called, and 3 of their cars were dispatched to the scene. 90 minutes later, an officer found Tyson in a ditch near death. That's when it all went downhill. While Tyson was rushed to the hospital, rescuers found the train lying on its side in the bush, further away from the severed tracks. The bodies of the young men were relatively unharmed, but the same could not be said for Imani. A bomb disposal team was brought in to defuse the explosives. Christie read about how GRT Corporation, the owner of the local freight rail system, was beaten in the courts of law and in the court of public opinion, forcing it to pay significant compensation to the survivor of Mr. Kane and the city. The GRT immediately began dismantling the rails from the branch. The rusty rails and creosote-soaked sleepers were torn down and hauled away. Road crews then graded and leveled the railroad track and laid a beautiful 6-foot-wide ribbon of smooth asphalt from the accident site to the eastern edge of town. Removal of the rails within the city limits was refused. With permission from the city council, road crews built the straight and level 2-lane road that Christie currently uses. When construction was completed, the city council closed the old country road to vehicular traffic, making it part of the trail system. Once it connected to the western edge of town, it created a 15-mile semicircular loop. As with any new urban development, elected officials put their sticky fingers in every pie. Large tracts of land next to the new road, and more importantly, not surrounded by granite slabs, were opened up with new zoning to build luxury housing. Entire neighborhoods of huge mansions sprang up. Fortunately for homeowners around the lake, ownership of the land south of the old railroad line has remained in the hands of GRT. They are not allowing any new development. The existing lakefront property agreements with GRT contain a grandfather clause, so they remain in effect. No more homes will be built on the lake. Once Christie had a clear picture of the events surrounding this man, she looked directly into his history and saw evidence that he was indeed a mathematical genius. His education was impeccable, and the reviews of his career at the university made her wish he was still there. Several times he had been spoken of as a big teddy bear, if he could be a genius mathematician. She looked through the university's photo archives and saw how the man had gained such a reputation over the years. He had been 53 years old at the time of the accident, and as large a man as she had ever seen. Now he appeared to her as a 58-year-old chubby bear, using a walker or a wheelchair if the stories of his injuries were to be believed. However, she just needed his brain to free her from her current mental block. Driving past a neighborhood of monster houses, Christie shook her head. The land around them was open and barren. She thought they should have planted big trees around the houses, like they had done in her parents' neighborhood. A railroad track crossing the new road was visible ahead, and seeing no one approaching from one side or the other, she drove over a small knoll and into the woods. After a while, she turned onto the old road leading to the lakeshore. Christie looked at the envelope again and saw the house number she needed to find. Tyson's house was closer to the other end of the road, so she drove on, enjoying the scenery. The houses were all on the lakeside, of course, and many of them were gated, which seemed silly to her since they were all open to the lake. Fortunately, all the houses were single-story and fit in with the natural habitat. Some were double-wide to make up for the lack of 2 stories. Finally, she saw the numbers approaching her destination address, and she slowed down and turned onto the gravel driveway. There was no other car in the driveway, and she worried that he might not be home. The house itself was so cute. It was a ranch-style cottage tucked away amongst the trees, with many unique and thoughtful design touches. She almost expected to see fairies flying through the lush gardens surrounding the house. Shutting off the engine, she got out of the car and breathed deeply of the morning air. It smelled so fresh and clean. She checked her outfit one last time. She had dressed for success in her best business attire, a red silk blouse, tight black pants, and sexy but low-heeled red leather shoes to match the top. She didn't want to exaggerate her advantages, so she wore a top that didn't fit her breasts as tightly. She didn't have any pants that didn't suit her, so she chose black ones that could visually reduce her graceful curves. Climbing the 3 steps to the front door, she prepared to speak. She pressed the bell and heard a faint sound from inside. After standing for a moment, she pressed the bell again. Still nothing. Christie hadn't planned for this development. She had a dozen different strategies for appealing to his teaching instinct, but it would be okay if he just wasn't around. She stood on the step of his front door and looked around. Maybe he'd gone to the neighbors? The lack of a car in the driveway and garage suggested he'd gone somewhere. Come on, you can do it. Don't give up. The morning was so quiet that faint words reached her from her left. She looked at the neighbor's house and saw that it was also 1 story, but with a roof deck. An elderly white-haired woman stood on it, binoculars to her face, watching something toward the water. Curious, Christy walked down the steps, walked to the house, and saw the gate to the backyard. There was a small sign hanging on them that said, "Private." But after thinking for a moment, she went through them anyway. A path led between the house and a 6-foot hedge to the backyard. Although the wall of plants seemed to come right down to the water's edge, she realized that the house was much deeper than she had expected. It must be very large inside. The impression of the house was not the same as the sidewalk. Her attention was drawn to the sounds of coughing and gasping, and she looked at the water. Someone was trying to get out of the lake. He managed to get to his feet and staggered a few feet forward. Then his muscles shook, and he fell forward onto his hands and knees, his head thrown back, and he continued to gulp for air. She instinctively moved to help. He let out a deep, throaty roar of defiance, and she stopped at the back corner of the house to lean against him, watching him rise to his feet. He was naked. He stood with his eyes closed, breathing heavily, supplying oxygen to his trembling muscles. When he was a little stronger, he started to climb out of the shallow water toward the house. He raised both hands and ran them from his forehead back over his head, squeezing water out of the tight curls of his long black hair. It made the gray patches on his temples stand out. Christy didn't know what to do. She arrived at the plush professor's house, and there was some stout man staying at his house. Her eyes ran over his strong, lean body. He was definitely in good physical shape, as his musculature was unusually textured. He wasn't bulky, but his muscles were very noticeable. His skin was smooth, and there was a lot of it. She noticed that he limped slightly as he leaned on his left knee. She noticed the scars on that joint, so he'd had knee surgery? She didn't notice that he had stopped moving until he spoke. "Who the hell are you, and why are you trespassing?" His voice was deep and his tone was angry. Christy automatically became defensive. She took a step away from the building and into the backyard. "I'm Christy Taylor. I'm here to talk to Professor Kane." The man frowned and continued walking to the chair where the robe lay. He made no attempt to hide himself from her gaze, and her eyes returned to his groin before she forced herself to look at his face again. She followed the expression on his face to see if he liked her attention, but saw only anger and annoyance there. He picked up his robe and put it on, buttoning it tightly over his flat stomach before looking at her again. "There's no one here by that name. Go away." "Professor Haley told me he lives here. He sent me to talk to Professor Kane," she insisted, more confident now that his body was covered. The man paused as the expression on his face indicated discomfort. "George Haley?" "Yes, I have a letter from him to give to Professor Kane," she said, smiling, anticipating victory. She would get this man to tell her where Tyson Kane was. Maybe it was a cousin and Tyson had come to town in his car. The guy in the bathrobe was late 30s, early 40s. There was some resemblance to the professor. He held out his hand and she looked at it, then back at his annoyed expression. "Give me the letter," he growled. She frowned. "No, I have to give it directly to Professor Kane." "And I told you there is no Professor Kane here? Only Tyson Kane, and that's me. Give me the letter." Christy opened her eyes wide, looking at his impatient face. He gestured for her to hand over the letter. You can't be him." Confusion was reflected on his face. "What do you mean? Of course I can." He's almost 60. You can't be that old," she exclaimed. He snorted amusedly, then his face darkened again. "Look, I don't have time for this, especially since, as you say, I'm almost 60. Either give me the letter George wrote for me, or leave." "If you're a he, why did you say there was no one here by that name?" she asserted. He frowned again. "I said Professor Kane isn't here. He died 5 years ago. I haven't taught anyone since that night." Something in his facial expression hinted at the horrors he'd experienced. Christy's jaw dropped in surprise and she believed him. It was Tyson Kane, but he looked completely different. She had to admit that the way he looked now was a huge improvement. Teddy bears were cute, sure, but this? Her gaze stopped again on the long black hair that now dried down his back. The gray spots on his temples took on a new significance. They hadn't been there in the photos before the accident. "A letter?" She shuddered, then reached into her purse and handed him an envelope. He took it from her and looked at the inscription on the front. With a deep sigh, he opened it. Christy let her eyes roam over his body while his attention was diverted. She hadn't felt such excitement in a long time. Tyson unfolded the paper with trepidation. The letter on the envelope was definitely George's. His eyes interpreted the quickly scribbled message. Dear Tyson, I hope this letter finds you in good health. The person standing before you is Miss Christy Taylor. She is in my class, and over the past few months, her grades have dropped dramatically and unexpectedly. She is a very bright and promising person, so this drop in her grades is unusual, and I am not sure of the cause. You're probably asking why you should care, and I can't give you any other answer than that it would be a favor to me if you took some time to analyze what's causing her problems and point her in the right direction. I found myself in the rather awkward position of owing her father a decent amount of money after a night of exceptionally bad poker play at his house. He said he would accept this help in lieu of the money owed to him. I don't want to directly interfere with her grades, so tutoring is the only possible option. I can't show favoritism to my students, and hardly anyone can, but you could turn the tide on her academic performance as quickly as possible. Please do not mention the gambling debt to Miss Taylor. I don't want her to have any doubt that she achieved her grades through her efforts alone. Thank you for your attention, your friend, George. Another sigh escaped from the tense muscles of his chest. He really didn't want to do this, but he couldn't refuse George's request. Of all his friends, George was the only one who kept coming to visit, though Tyson didn't know why, since he was a terrible host. This was peculiar to Imani. He folded the letter and carefully placed it back in the envelope, but it was only a delaying tactic, as he tried to think of what to say to the girl standing in front of him. Will you do it? She asked. He looked into her eyes and realized he was getting ready to nod. Had anyone ever said no to this beauty? He controlled his expression. I haven't even had breakfast yet. Go ahead. You can tell me why I should give you my precious time. He headed straight for the patio doors leading to the living room of his house. When he gestured for the charming blonde to take a seat, he saw her looking around admiringly. This made him look around once more to see what she was seeing, but instead, all he saw was a reminder of someone who was no longer in his life. His mood plummeted. He walked over to the small wood stove that heated the room, opened the door, and threw George's letter inside. As soon as he closed the door, the letter ignited and soon turned to ash. He turned to look at his guest. I need to shower and get dressed. Then I'll make breakfast. Have you eaten yet? He asked. She nodded quickly. But I wouldn't mind an espresso or coffee if you make them. He frowned and pointed to the coffee machine in the kitchen. He'd never learned how to use it, but the last time George had come to visit, he'd brought a few varieties of beans, used the grinder and espresso machine, and made them both a nice drink with the damn thing. It works, but I have no idea how to use it. If you know, help yourself. Tyson left without looking to see if she needed anything else. He closed the bedroom door and made his way to the bathroom to put his robe in the laundry basket. He took a quick shower, shaved and dressed, putting on shorts and a black t-shirt. He rubbed a small amount of unscented liniment on his left knee, as it had been sore since the morning. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and headed back into the living room. He noticed a blonde girl, no, Miss Taylor, standing in the kitchen in front of the espresso machine. She was making her usual noises, and he figured she knew what she was doing. She turned to smile at him, and he was struck by how familiar she seemed to him at that moment. There was something about her. This car is great. Much better than the one my parents have at home, she enthuses. The aching sense of familiarity disappeared along with the young woman's enthusiasm. I'm more of a plain black coffee drinker myself, but Imani knows her way around an espresso, he said, without enthusiasm. She smiled sympathetically at him, and he immediately moved towards the refrigerator as he needed to make breakfast. He grabbed 2 eggs, yogurt, spinach, and a few small tomatoes. As he cooked the eggs, he looked over at her working the espresso machine. She was making 2 small cups of coffee. It's a very good bean, she noted with pleasure. He nodded slightly. George brought them here. She nodded and finished the preparations. The espresso was ready. When I first arrived, I didn't see a car in the driveway. I thought maybe you'd gone into town. I don't drive, he said bluntly. She looked at him apprehensively. Because of Yes, he said, interrupting her. She paused, hearing his curt reply. She slid a small mug toward him, and he nodded his thanks. How do you buy groceries? She asked. He looked at her tiredly. They deliver. He took a sip of the espresso, and it was delicious, but very strong. He smiled at her expectant look, and her face lit up with a brilliant smile. The feeling of recognition returned to him, but he still couldn't find the clue that would connect the dots. You have a beautiful home. Is that the door to the second bedroom? She asked, pointing to the door to the right of his bedroom door. Most of the things in this room had once belonged to Imani. Yeah, but it's just junk storage and a place where I work out in my home gym. Tyson finished making breakfast and took it to a small table near the patio door so he could look out over the lake while he ate. Of course, Miss Taylor considered it an invitation to sit between him and the door, blocking his view. She smiled at him, and that made him irritated. He felt pressured, and he didn't like it. George told you I wouldn't teach idiots? He stated, regretting his bluntness as the words flew from his lips. Yes, Professor Haley made it clear that I must prove myself worthy of your time, she replied calmly. I? Miss Taylor continued her presentation, and Tyson listened silently, eating his breakfast. He felt himself nodding approvingly when he heard something that impressed him, and she seemed to sit up a little higher when he did, her smile showing that she was pleased to receive this tiny bit of praise. When she got to the end and talked about how her grade was going down, he remembered George's comment about the riddle. He was forced to agree. This woman had so much privilege, and yet it was starting to roll off, and she was making no effort to address it. Why? He asked bluntly. Her smile trembled as she thought she'd explained why. He saw her confusion. No, why is this grade sagging? He could see that the house had fallen into thought, and she was silent, pondering it. Finally, she seemed to have found something. Compared to this, my other classes are very simple. It feels like I already know all the material and everything goes by itself. In this class, I'm going to have to put more effort into it. And you didn't make much of an effort because... Her gaze stopped on him as her smile slid off her face, and he saw a momentary flash of depression. He was very familiar with this enemy. Count your privileges, he said, and her expression darkened. The fire of anger flared in her beautiful eyes. Look, I know I'm one of the lucky ones to be born into wealth and privilege, she began, as her steam started to get out of control. Tyson shook his head. No, it's an exercise for the mind. Count the things you're grateful for. She blinked. Am I being subjected to a psychiatric evaluation? She asked, suddenly recognizing the process. He looked at her sternly. If I want to teach you, I need to know if your block is purely conceptual or tied to something emotional. You need a different approach for each. He wanted to tell her he wasn't in the right state of mind to deal with other people's emotional baggage, but something held his tongue. She nodded to him with widened eyes and went back to thinking about her privileges as he labeled them. It can't be, just concepts, he clarified, and she threw him an annoyed look. She cleared her throat delicately. I'm thankful for my family. I'm thankful for my friends. I'm thankful for my fiancé. I'm thankful that I can attend this university. I'm thankful for... Stop. You just mentioned the most significant sources of your happiness potential. People. Which one was a lie? She made a sound of indignation, but he didn't listen and pushed forward. Your parents. Does your father pressure you to do something in your life? If your mom is overly critical of your choices? He states. No, they're not like that at all. They only support me, she snarled. But he noticed something in her expression again. So they support something you don't agree with. Let's move on, he pressed, and her resentment only increased. He didn't care since he had nothing to lose. He understood George's refusal to correct her assessment. Besides, Tyson was defending his integrity as a teacher, even though he had no desire to return to that profession. Your friends. Do you have any friends in your clique? Someone you don't trust has your back? Someone who may be plotting against you right now? He asked. Not again. I don't let people with poisonous personalities near me, she snarled. B nodded. Then it must be the groom. Does he leave much to be desired? Is he too assertive? Not assertive enough? Is he abusing you? He would never... She gasped, her eyes wide. She stared at Tyson like a rabid dog. But in bed, he doesn't rock your world? Asked Tyson, catching the hesitation and making a wild guess. Miss Taylor stood up and walked around the table. He saw the slap coming, but just accepted it. He experienced more intense pain as well. Part 4. Christy jumped out of the house and got into the driver's seat of her car before tears came to her eyes. She wasn't even sure why she was crying. She told herself it was because of his rude behavior, but she didn't allow herself to admit that was completely accurate. He was right, and she couldn't accept it. She let herself release the tension and gradually suppressed the tears until they stopped. She couldn't give up, or she would fail the course. She didn't want to prove to the man in the house that he was right in his assumption of her unworthiness. She was absolutely worthy. Christy climbed out of the car and picked up a bag from the back seat that contained her math textbooks and notes. She took a deep breath and turned back toward the cottage-style house. Be brave or go home. She walked back to the front door and rang the bell. After a few moments, a suspicious expression appeared on the man's face as he peered through the door. "I'm sorry I slapped you." The expression on his face didn't change when he spoke to her. "No, you're not. You had your reasons for doing that. I was rude." She waited a second. "May I come in?" He sighed and stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. She walked back to the table and set her book bag on it. He looked at him, frowning. "I haven't agreed to teach you yet. You've identified a problem that affects my grades. Only half of the problem is solved. Identifying a problem is a good start, but you need a definite plan to solve it. Otherwise, it will continue to block you," he says. "I'm calling off the wedding," she announced, surprised herself at how good those words sounded. She felt a weight lifted from her shoulders. Tyson's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That seems pretty extreme for a little problem in the bedroom. You could just go to counseling about it." She frowned and shook her head. It's not just about sex. She thought for a moment, and with the decision to end the engagement already made, the rest of the truth she'd been hiding from herself came to light. I think it's because we're too much alike. Our worlds are identical. Our likes and dislikes are the same. There's no friction, no spark. It would be easy to be married to Blake, but I think I'd eventually die of boredom or start having affairs. I have no doubt he would have had them too. When he proposed, I was overwhelmed with excitement at the prospect of marriage. But that's not enough. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. She looked at the diamond ring on her hand and pulled it off her finger with a sigh. She liked the ring a lot. She put it in her purse. "Can we get started?" she asked, and he couldn't suppress a slight snort of pleasure at her persistence. "Did I already say I agreed to teach you?" he asked in response. Blue eyes met his brown eyes. "You've identified the problem, and I've described my plan to solve it. I won't let it interfere with my career. What more do you need?" asserted Christy. He nodded to himself as she demonstrated that she was serious, and she saw his last reservation slipping away. "Great. Take me to the last section you were comfortable in," Tyson said, taking a seat next to her at the small table. She smiled, pulled out her books and turned to her notes. They spent the rest of the morning taking notes. He took her back 2 more chapters before he was sure she understood the material. "You've started to miss some points," he remarked, and she remembered when they'd started studying that chapter. It was a few weeks after the engagement had begun. How had he known? She glanced at Tyson, and he looked at her curiously, but she just shook her head with a shy smile and turned her attention back to the textbook. He walked her through the chapters, explaining the formulas and showing examples of their use. Christy made notes as she went along and felt herself absorbing the information. She held up her hand for him to stop at the specific problem they were solving. She remembered that she had gotten seriously frustrated with this section before, but now it seemed much clearer to her. "Why can't they teach it the way you do? It's so much clearer than what you just explained," she exclaimed frustratedly. He shrugged. "Different teachers have their own teaching style, but math is math. Numbers have their own beautiful language." He glanced at the wall clock. "Are you hungry?" She nodded, smiling slightly. "I was just about to make a salad with grilled chicken." "Will that work for you?" asked Tyson, and her smile widened as she nodded at him. "While I make lunch, go over these 3 questions," he said. pointing to the textbook. "Yes, sir," she said with a smirk. He went into the kitchen, and she caught herself watching his ass move in his tight shorts. She went back to her notebook and started solving equations. She managed the first two, but before she got to the third, she was distracted by images of Tyson climbing out of the lake. She couldn't believe he was 58. He looked sexy as hell coming out of the water naked. "What is your concern in question 3? She squeaked when his voice caught her in a semi-conscious state. "I'm sorry, what?" He frowned. "I said, what's bothering you on the third?" "Oh, nothing. I was just a little distracted," she replied. He raised an eyebrow, then set the plates of lunch on the table while she concentrated on finishing the last question. After finishing her work, she handed it to him. He quickly confirmed that she knew the material. "It looks like you have everything under control. We'll be finalizing the next 4 chapters this afternoon. You're doing very well, so it must have been just a little conceptual misunderstanding." "No, I don't think you realize how much difference there is between your teaching method and learning this material," she insisted. He shook his head. "I'm not a teacher anymore." She shrugged. "And it's a damn shame. If you need my help this afternoon, you'll drop it." She threw up her hands in surrender. They started on their lunches, and Christy was impressed. The salad was fresh, the grilled chicken was spicy and a little spicy, which went well with the dressing. "It's like spicy chicken wings in a cool, creamy dressing." He smiled and nodded. Secret recipe. After a few minutes of silence, Christy could no longer suppress the urge to ask him a question. "If you don't drive, do you go outside for more than just your morning swim?" He cast an appraising glance at her, then decided to answer. "I take a walk every day. Today I'll do it after we finish chapter 4. "Where do you walk?" she asked. "I take the road along the lake shore and back, 6 miles. "I have some gym clothes in my car. Can I join you today?" she asked boldly. He looked into her eyes, but there was only hope in them. He seemed troubled by something as he continued to stare at her. He looked like he wanted to say no, but relented. "Okay." She looked around and tried to count all the pictures of Tyson and his wife scattered around the room, but lost count. "You sure have a lot of pictures. I can't get over how much you've changed." He too looked around and shrugged. "Like I said, the man in those pictures died that night. Everything he thought was important died. I'm not Professor Kane. I'm just Tyson Kane now." "Is math important?" Tyson froze, then looked into the blue eyes, challenging him to take back his words. "Let's finish with the tutoring," he said stiffly. They spent the next 3 hours studying the 4 chapters of the textbook. Christy took detailed notes of his explanations and asked many questions. He never once lost his temper or expressed the slightest displeasure. She looked more and more relaxed as the class progressed, and when they finished the last chapter, she closed her notebook with a satisfied sigh. "Now I have a backup. We've gone through one more chapter than what is taught at the university, and I know the methods and formulas. I'm going to pass the next test with flying colors. I can feel it. Thank you so much." He nodded at her and tore his gaze away from her smile with a concerned expression. "Are you ready to go for a walk?" Christy asked. He stood up and stretched, and her gaze stopped at the exposed part of his stomach, admiring his muscles. "Yeah, I just need to change." "Now I'll put my textbooks away and get my gym clothes," she said, and jumped up from her chair. She stuffed her textbooks into her bag and ran outside. She changed bags in the car and carried her bag into the house. "You can change in the guest bathroom," he suggested, and she headed inside. As soon as the door closed, she allowed herself a mischievous grin. He won't know what hit him. Tyson watched the bathroom door close and thought about how he ended up in this situation. Surely it was George's fault for referring her to him. She was very pleasant to look at, and her lovely outfit indicated a well-groomed body. He frowned. She was young enough to be his daughter, and almost his granddaughter. Putting that thought out of his mind, he headed to the bedroom and put on his jogging tights. Not that he was going to run this day since his knee was hurting. He put socks around his ankles. He went back to the living room, closed the patio doors, and took the keys. He sat down on the bench by the front door and put on his sneakers. He heard a noise and looked up. His jaw dropped and he froze, watching her sneak toward him. Running his gaze over her body, he saw that her jogging shorts were a splash of color beneath the strips of skin at her exposed ankles. The yoga pants were tight and emphasized her graceful curves. From ankle to knee, they were adorned with parrot feathers. The feathers ran up her long thighs and encircled her spectacular ass in orange, gold, and brown leopard print. The muscles of her flat stomach were firm and clearly visible from her waist to the bottom of the leopard print sports bra that contained and controlled her lush breasts. He saw that she bestowed a dazzling smile on him in response to his dumbfounded expression, and her beautiful blonde hair was tied back in a ponytail. What an outfit! "You like it? This is my first opportunity to wear it," she said, running her hands over the smooth fabric, and Tyson felt an unfamiliar rush of goosebumps between his legs. It had been years since he'd been aroused by a woman. He felt very uncomfortable that this was happening to such a young woman. "Yes, I mean it's very flattering. You look, yes, we should go," Tyson replied hesitantly, trying to find another place to look. She walked out the door with a satisfied smile on her lips, and his gaze immediately stopped on her ass. It took his breath away, because it really was one of the sexiest asses he'd ever seen. He closed the door and saw her looking at his ass in his pantyhose. Her face flushed red from being caught. Then her eyes widened slightly when she saw the bulge growing in the front of his pants. Tyson tried his best to relax as he walked down the path to the road. He turned left, and Christy sank down on the step beside him. He looked at her satisfied expression and frowned puzzled. "I'm sure it won't give you as good a workout as the gym. Besides, you'll be showing off your new outfit in front of a younger crowd who can better appreciate your beauty, your outfit." She bit her lip to hide a smile at his slip, then shook her head as they briskly strolled down the road. "The gym gets tiresome after a while, but getting outside once in a while is really nice," she said with a wide smile. "Besides, you're much more fit than anyone I've seen at our gym." He looked at her with raised eyebrows, and she nodded in agreement. "You're very handsome." "For a man who's almost 60, you mean?" he suggested. She held up her hands. "No, you just look beautiful. I don't see old age in you at all." They walked in silence as he pondered this new information. He was flattered, but no more than that. The truth was that he was nearing the end of his life, and she was just beginning hers. They reached the western end of the road where it once continued into town on a country road. They passed the spot where the railroad crossing used to be. As he always did, Tyson stopped to ponder the statistical impossibility of the events that had occurred that night. He almost wanted to call it a failure of numbers, but his empirical data proved that it could and did happen. "Is this the place?" said Christy softly, and he looked at her. He began to back away from the intersection, heading east on the road, and she followed him. "Yeah, they found me in that ditch." He pointed to a spot about 20 feet from the road where his body lay, torn from the wrecked car. They stopped again as there was a large stone nearby with Imani's name carved on it. She wasn't buried here, of course, but the town wanted to honor her memory, and here was the stone. He walked on. He switched to a light jog to take his mind off the reminders of the accident, and the pain in his knee wasn't too bad. Christy was jogging beside him, and he felt her watching him from the sidelines. He looked back, and she smiled sympathetically at him. "Please don't." For a moment she was silent. "Sorry." They continued jogging until he had to go back to walking as the pain signaled that it was not worth pushing his luck. "What's wrong with your knee?" she asked. "It needs replacing," he muttered. "From what I understand, it's a pretty straightforward operation these days," she suggested. He nodded, but didn't say anything. For him, it wasn't the thought of surgery, but the trip to the hospital itself that chilled his veins. The psychologist he'd met at the hospital had told him it could be overcome with therapy, but he hadn't been back to the hospital since. His life just stopped. "I can give you a ride if you want." "No, I'm sorry. No, I don't drive or ride in cars," he insisted. She was silent again, and he tried his best not to look at her, not to see her disappointment, but finally he had to look at her. It wasn't disappointment. It was pity, which was worse. "Don't! Look, I don't deserve your pity. I don't need it," he growled. But his voice shook, ruining the moment of defiance. He squirmed. They walked down the tree-lined street, soaking up the atmosphere of nature. "I suppose if you had to choose a prison, you chose well. It's very nice here," Christy said quietly. He shifted his indignant gaze to her, but she only held his gaze and didn't argue. His jaw worked, but there were no words. He tried to jog away from her, but after 2 steps, he was back to walking. His knee couldn't take it either. She went back to him to support him, and stayed there until they reached the east end of the road leading to the lake, where they turned around and started back along the lake side of the road. Christy looked at the houses along the road with interest. "How much would it cost to buy one of these houses?" she asked finally. He snorted. "You'll never find an owner willing to sell, even if he could." Sensing her look, he clarified. "Property taxes are 0 because the land is actually owned by GRT. We can't change the square footage of the houses or add additional floors. We don't have the right to put in driveways. The houses are rented out, so we cannot sell them, but we can transfer the lease to family members. The original owners of GRT were old-school pioneers and believed in family homesteading. So even with all the restrictions, we got a very favorable offer. However, there is a lot of potential money embedded in this land. The lease expires in about 60 years, at which time one of 2 things is likely to happen. GRT can evict everyone and sell off the lots at a great price per lot. Huge mansions will be built in place of these bungalows." "What's the other option?" she asked. "Rumor has it that GRT will screw the city council by entering into another century-old lease with the current owners with the same restrictions." He saw the incredulous expression on the pretty blonde's face. Before the accident and subsequent lawsuit, tensions between the city council and GRT had dropped considerably. The council tried to get them to hand over the property around the lake and the woods. Instead, they got a new road so the city could build a new neighborhood for themselves and their developer buddies. This caused a new wave of animosity between them and GRT. Stupid, greedy bastards. "So those houses I saw on the way? 80% of them are owned by city council members," he said grimly. They continued on their way as Christy seemed to be immersed in thought. "Blake's mother is a city councilwoman and his father is a real estate developer," she finally said. He saw the worry in her eyes and shrugged. "Better to know now than later, when the oath is taken." When they got back to his house, Tyson's knee was hurting badly. It wasn't worth aggravating it with a jog. He noticed his neighbor on the west side, Mrs. Willoughby, working on the flower bush by her gate. He remembered that she preferred to be addressed by her first name. "Good afternoon, Barbara." She looked at those approaching, and when she saw Christy beside him, her smile widened. "Good afternoon, Tyson. It's so nice to see you outside in such fine company." He sighed, looking at Barbara's efforts to please him. "This is Christy Taylor. She's at the university in town, and George sent her to me for math tutoring. Christy, this is Barbara Willoughby, my neighbor." Christy shook his neighbor's hand, and they exchanged smiles. "It's so good to hear that you're teaching again," exclaimed Barbara. "He is an amazing teacher. He solved the problem that was preventing me from understanding the last chapters, and now I have no doubts about passing the exam," says Christy with equal enthusiasm. Tyson threw both women a disappointed look when they answered him with delighted smiles. "I'm not going back to teaching. This was a one-time thing, as a favor to George." Barbara pouted her lips disapprovingly. "Now that would be a shame. You have such a wonderful talent that it would go to waste." "It's my choice, isn't it?" he asserted. The ladies exchanged glances, and Tyson finished. "Have a nice evening, Barbara," he said, and turned to walk down the driveway. He heard Christy quietly say goodbye and hurried after him. He opened the front door and held it open for Christy. Seeing that Barbara was still watching him, he waved and went inside. He closed the door and heard Christy's joyful sigh behind him. He turned and froze. Her perfect breasts were no longer constricted and hidden by her yoga bra. "What? What are you doing?" he gasped. She smiled, slowly rubbing the rubber band marks on her skin. "I know it helps keep my girls in place, but I'm much happier taking my bra off," she sighed. "You can't?" She moved closer and his gaze lingered on her breasts, on which a light sheen of sweat glistened. "I think I can," she murmured, looking at the bulge straining against his tights. In a moment, Christie's firm breasts pressed tightly against his chest, and only then did he realize how tightly he was holding her against him. He tried to pull away from her. "No!" Christie shrieked insistently, and knelt down in front of him to pull his tights down to his ankles. "Shit!" exclaimed Tyson. He had no experience with this, as Imani had denied him something like this, though she had no problem getting it herself. Christie stroked with great enthusiasm with her hands what wouldn't fit in her mouth. This led to one serious problem for Tyson. It had been over 5 years since he'd had sex with anyone else in the room. He wasn't going to stick around for long. No, not at all. "Christie, Christie, this is too good," he gasped. She looked up at him with excited blue eyes and purred happily. The extra vibration was enough to push Tyson to the limit. After finishing, he pulled away because he was too sensitive. Christie stood before him with a hungry look. "Can you give as good as you get?" He blinked, but realized what she wanted. Did he want this? With her? Now that she'd given him the most fantastic moment of his life, he felt somewhat obligated to return the favor. As his eyes sank into her body, he realized that he really wanted this so badly. Without allowing himself to think, he grabbed her hand and dragged her through the living room and into the bedroom. He stopped beside the bed and pulled her to him. "You're so beautiful," Tyson sighed. Her nervousness vanished, and she pulled his face to hers. Next, things moved to the lower part of her body. He had spent quite a bit of time between his wife's legs, so he knew what Imani liked, but Christie seemed more sensitive, so he had to be less aggressive. For now. He listened to her sighs and cooing, learning what she liked and what she didn't. "Oh shit, yes," she shouted. Christie's voice trailed off as she finished, robbed of the ability to do anything more than gasp. He could feel her body shuddering with the violent pulses of muscle contractions and trembling. He rose to his feet and watched her rest. A little voice in his head asked him what the hell was he thinking he was doing. Another moment of clarity hit him, and he nearly faltered from the sudden rearrangement of his thinking. He was no longer thinking with his little head, and the big head was furious. She was practically a child. He had never been promiscuous, never even liked flirting. And here he was, basking after a very pleasant lovemaking session, with a young woman he'd only known for a few hours. What had made him break his usual behavior? Indeed, she was beautiful and intelligent, but they were separated by several generations. They had nothing in common. Even their value systems didn't match. Even though he had lived alone for a little over 5 years and was a widower, he still wore his wedding ring. He did not need to be faithful to his wife, since he no longer had her. Still, he felt guilty, as if he had broken some unspoken rule. What's wrong? He looked at the beauty, who was leaning on her elbows again. "Yeah, I don't know why I did it," he said, and his heart clenched in his chest like a lump of cold stone. "You're overthinking our skit between two consenting adults," she replied, and watched the lost expression on his face. "I think you're attractive, and your mind intrigues me. You think I am the same, don't you?" She raised a dainty eyebrow at him. "Definitely, and I think you intrigue me as well," he admitted awkwardly. She nodded with a smile. "That's all it takes. Just a hookup, but an awesome one. No one has expectations, though I'd love to see what you can do with it," she said. He was still reeling from the change in behavior, so he nodded shakily and headed for the bathroom. He stepped into the shower stall and turned on the water. He jumped slightly when he felt her hands on his back. He looked back at her, and a smile played on her lips. He turned to face her to explain how bad an idea this was, and she kissed him again. Tyson needed her. Now. He reached back and turned off the shower. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders as he led her out of the shower. He sat her down on the towel he'd left on the toilet counter and pulled her to him, and the unforgettable flight into the sexual world began. He stopped with widened eyes. "A condom?" "Pill, go on," she insisted with an expression of intense concentration on her face. It was better than anything he could remember. Christie was so damn horny. His body was so hard and strong, and his need was so intense that she felt herself being taken over by his passion. Her end robbed her of her sanity, but he kept pounding into her anyway, and the sparks grew. She was losing the ability to do anything but soak up the bliss. Her mind filled with a strange mixture of bliss, surrender, surprise, and confidence. Because she felt so welcome and protected, she shook her head. None of it made sense, but it seemed incredibly important at that moment. Her head was all jumbled up, and all she could do was press herself against his trembling body, pull his face to hers, and kiss his lips softly. But kisses were like promises she wasn't sure she should make, so she leaned his forehead against hers. Gasping, Tyson could feel the last bursts of pleasure slowly fading away. His muscles were humming with energy, like after a particularly strenuous workout, and he felt better than he had at any time since that night. He pulled away gently, and Christy released her grip on his head. He dropped his hands to her breasts, where his gaze lingered for a moment. He was still pressing her against the counter with his pelvis, so he gently released the pressure and pulled free. She shrieked and gasped when he pulled away. He hoped he hadn't hurt her too badly. Looking at her face, he realized she was really out of it, and gently moved to pick her up in his arms. She sighed, pressing her face against his shoulder. Tyson carried her back to the bedroom. His brain was screaming something to him, something very familiar. He laid her down on the bed, her hair spread across the pillow, and her hands drew him to her lips. The kiss was hot, passionate, but tender at the same time. When he pulled away, his muscles quivered. Her blue eyes looked up at him, a question in them as she felt his muscles quiver. His eyes were so wide. Ashley, young, like at the beginning of their university career, just as beautiful. Why hadn't he seen this before? "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He couldn't speak, so he just nodded. He needed air. Tyson stood on the shore of the lake, and the cool breeze blowing off the lake sent shivers down his spine. He didn't know how he'd gotten here. "She's really beautiful." There's that voice again. He raised his eyes to the sky. Dusk was just beginning to fall in the sky, which meant she had come early. He turned his head to the right. Imani was standing next to him, almost close enough to touch. He really wanted to do it, but he knew he couldn't. A breeze brushed a mane of hair back from her face, and she turned her sad eyes to him. "The lake doesn't want to see you." He took a step away from her, as her words sounded like a slap. "The woman on the inside knows." He shook his head in confusion, then shifted his gaze to the glass patio doors. Inside, wrapped in the plaid from his bed, lay Christy. "What?" He looked back at Imani, but she wasn't there. The fact that he had tried to talk to her shook him more than he wanted to admit. He shuddered again, and his legs twisted him out of the dark water. His feet carried him across the yard to the backyard, and his hands opened the door and led him inside. Blue eyes looked anxiously into his brown ones. He felt pressured to come clean and gave in. "She said the lake didn't need me." Soft hands touched his chest, and he felt a chill on his skin. Christy spread the plaid and pulled him into a cocoon of warmth, warming him with her body. They stood face to face. "Who said that?" Christy asked. He looked into her eyes and saw only warmth. He didn't want to answer, but something told him it would be okay. Imani. She watched him, and he watched her, and a slight smile appeared on her lips. "A smart woman. Could you tell me about her?" she asked, sitting him down on the couch in front of the small wood stove. He put another log in the stove and went back to Christy under the blanket. He felt lighter, more peaceful. He was ready to talk, and Christy listened. To be continued. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like along with a bell.